Life has been a string of hard knocks interspersed with a few good breaks. Losing my parents early impacted me hard, like a sting that never completely goes away. However, I was fortunate to be taken in by the elderly Robinson couple who lived next door. They were the most gentle people you could meet. They didn't treat me like a charity case, more like a grandchild. We were wealthy in love, and that's what really mattered. We weren't wealthy materially, that is until they passed away in a car crash. Right as I was starting to come into my own, approaching my 18th birthday and considering going to college, in an instant, I found myself back on my own. The Robinsons left me some cash for my education and their former suburban home. Though I didn't like the amount of ghosts there, it was a warm place full of memories. I decided to sell it and get a tiny apartment in the city, close to the institution where I had enrolled to pursue a degree in financial management. It was at a friend's party that I first met Jonathan. He was breezy, irreverent, and cared not who found out. We clicked right away, spilling my drink as he bumped into me. His energy was contagious. I said, "Hey, watch it," more surprised than angry. "All right, I apologize. I'll make it right for you." "What did you drink?" Jonathan gave this brazen smile. "Beer, just beer," I murmured while attempting to control my smile. He turned to face the improvised bar and yelled above the music, "2 beers," coming right up. That was Jonathan in a nutshell, uncomplicated, direct, and fuss-free. We spoke about everything and nothing for the entire evening. It came out that we detested sushi and adored vintage films. Speaking with him was effortless, and as the celebration came to an end, I found it difficult to say goodbye. His proposal came a year later. We were watching TV together, just the two of us, with a ring he fumbled out of his pocket. No big gestures. He said, "Marry me," clutching the ring so firmly that I was afraid he would shatter it. I chuckled, not because it was humorous, but rather because it was so typical of us, so wonderfully flawed, that I genuinely laughed. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married initially brought about little change. It felt right that we were the same but legally obligated. We made ourselves at home in my tiny downtown flat, close to the bustle, but having someone to spend the quiet times with, evenings didn't feel quite so empty for the first time in a long time, and life felt full. Marriage brings certain conveniences, but you can never feel too comfortable in life before something unexpected happens. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Jonathan's parents, were treasures. They greeted me warmly from the beginning, welcoming me into their comfortable suburban house. I could sense Jonathan's laid-back personality coming off them. Their kindness was a salve to my frequently hurting heart, which was still raw from my own familial losses. Mrs. Thomas would often say, "So happy you're part of our family now," and she would squeeze my hand in a way that was simultaneously overpowering and encouraging. "I'm grateful," I would honestly say. "Thank you so much for being so welcoming," in my reply. We started making time for them every weekend. Backyard barbecues and long talks over steaming coffee cups characterized those days. Simple, honest, and good life. Up until it wasn't. Jonathan had to embark on a year-long work trip that took him out of state. Although the timing was unfortunate, it was a great opportunity for his career. The health of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas declined rather quickly as soon as Jonathan departed. It happened quickly, and when Mrs. Thomas called, she sounded almost completely worried. "Bless her heart, Jasmine," she began shakily. "We need your help. I'm sorry to bother you, but I could use your assistance in this situation." Her voice was heavy with unshed tears as she said, "Mr. Thomas is not doing well." I grabbed my stuff and made a quick trip to the suburbs. It disturbed me to see Mr. and Mrs. Thomas looking so thin. He had always been rock solid and unwavering. He appeared smaller now, connected to life by a tangle of tubes for medical purposes. I moved easily into their domestic routine, taking care of the cooking and cleaning, while Mrs. Thomas attended to Mr. Thomas's needs. I used to spend my evenings reading aloud from his favorite classics to them, with his eyelids frequently fluttering closed before I could finish a chapter. On good days he would mumble, "Thank you, Jasmine," his voice losing some of its former strength. "It's my pleasure, really," I would remark, holding his hand and attempting to console him with a kind touch. Mrs. Thomas sat down at the kitchen table one calm day as I was preparing vegetables for dinner. Her worried expression made her appear older than she was. She wrung her hands anxiously and said, "Jasmine, I don't know where to start this, but we're having a slight issue. Mr. Thomas was the main earner, you know, and with him like this," I put down the knife and focused entirely on her. "Honey, we're in a hurry. Would you think about renting out your apartment? I hate to even ask. Maybe it will help us get through this difficult time." She looked down, obviously mortified. Her comments weighed their predicament, hanging in the air. I felt sorry for them. When I had no family, they took me in and gave me one. How could I refuse? I tried to lighten Mrs. Thomas's load and said, "Of course, Mrs. Thomas. I'll get on it right away without even thinking twice." The apartment immediately found a tenant, and I diligently sent Mrs. Thomas the monthly rental income as well as funds for groceries and any unpaid bills. Family bonds are what keep families together, so even though the drive to my city work became a nightmare, it wasn't easy. Even on the most difficult days, I reminded myself of that often. Every time I gave Mrs. Thomas the money, she would express her relief by saying, "You're a godsend, Jasmine." My only comfort came from Jonathan's calls. His voice was a portal to another planet. "How are things going, Jazz? Are you doing all right?" Even through the static of long-distance talks, his concern was evident. I would force a smile into my voice and say, "We're handling it. Don't worry about us," so as not to add to his anxiety. Mrs. Thomas's sudden appearance of Courtney, her daughter from her first marriage, caused a radical alteration in the Thomas household dynamic. The atmosphere changed instantly. Courtney's presence was like a chill wind slipping beneath the door. Although I wasn't familiar with her, I had heard enough about her from Jonathan and had seen her icy interactions with Mr. and Mrs. Thomas during their brief but uncomfortable visits. Already, I was having a hard time fitting in. Long journeys to work while taking care of Mrs. Thomas, who was bedridden and rapidly losing her health. The tension, however, increased exponentially with Courtney's presence. She made herself feel at home and made it obvious that she was here to stay. One evening, following a particularly demanding day, Mr. Thomas made a feeble motion to draw me to him. His voice was a strained, anxious whisper. "Jasmine, please keep an eye out for Courtney," he replied. "She's a very bad person," and the gravity in his voice made my stomach clench. "Mr. Thomas, I get it. I pledged to exercise caution, even though I wasn't entirely clear what I was pledging to avoid." As Mr. Thomas had warned, Courtney didn't take long to set up her new order. The first indication appeared when I discovered her one morning in the kitchen, her presence hovering over the breakfast nook like a storm cloud. She sipped her coffee abruptly and regarded me as if I were an intruder in her mother's kitchen. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to serve as housemaid or chef for anyone," Courtney said. Even though I was surprised, I maintained my composure. "All right, Courtney," I answered, attempting to remain calm. "I can keep at it. I've been handling things so far." "That's good, because I won't be doing anything." "After all, this is Mom's house," she yelled back, daring me to argue with her. Courtney made sure her presence was felt, and not in a nice way. From that day on, she placed an order for takeout for her mother and herself alone, leaving the empty boxes for me to clear off the table. Her obvious contempt hurt, but I forced myself to swallow it since Mr. and Mrs. Thomas deserved some privacy. "Jasmine, why don't you stay and eat with us this evening?" Mrs. Thomas inquired one evening, with a rare hint of her former warmth in her voice. Courtney stopped me before I could reply. "Jasmine has been occupied all day, Mom. She probably prefers to eat later," she remarked, seeming genuinely concerned. I wasn't welcome, and that was the plain message. The days were longer and my chores multiplied. Courtney's conceit pervaded every area of the home. Late at night, she murmured to her mother, using venomous words to turn her against me. Mrs. Thomas began to shift. After initially being so kind and nice, her thank yous decreased and her expression grew austere. A few weeks later, Mr. Thomas departed from this life. Jonathan arrived at the funeral by plane in time to say his final goodbyes, and the event was sad. We had not seen each other in months, so it was a welcome change to have him at my side. While everyone was grieving, I observed a big change in the Thomas home. Courtney was acting extremely well, being forcibly courteous to everyone. "How have things been while I've been gone?" Jonathan asked me quietly after the service in our little alone time. "It's all right. Everything has been going well." I pretended to smile. His sadness was enough to bear. I didn't want to add to it. "Are you certain? You appear a little tired," he said, his brow pinched in worry. "You know, it's just been busy helping out around here," I said, trying not to look him in the eye. The moment was not right to investigate the chaos simmering beneath the surface. After Jonathan left, Courtney stopped performing the loyal sister act. Her disguise vanished, and I was left with the snide, disrespectful attitude to which I had become used. The atmosphere of the house changed significantly. Maybe to overcome her own deep sorrow, Mrs. Thomas became cold and aloof. Talks gave way to commands, and I started to feel less like a family member and more like an intruder. Courtney assumed control of the home as though she were the lady of the manor. She ruled with total indifference to anyone's sentiments save her own. Without knocking, she began storming into my room and going through my belongings as if she were looking for hidden gold. One day I was looking for some tranquility in the garden when I noticed a box tucked away amid the bushes. I opened it out of curiosity to discover my lingerie, jewels, and watches. My heart fell when I saw some of my outfits strewn close by. I gathered my things and clutched the box tightly as I stormed inside, boiling with rage. Courtney was kicking back in the living room like she ruled the place. "What the hell, Courtney?" With a trembling voice full of anger, I demanded, "You cannot simply throw my stuff out." Courtney let out a chilly laugh that reverberated mockingly across the space. "Jasmine, you don't reside here. Please remember that you are merely a visitor and not invited. It would be ideal for you to be outside in the garden or on the street. Regardless, you're nothing more than a vicious beggar." Her remarks hurt like salt on an open wound. I shuddered and turned to face Mrs. Thomas, who had just come into the room. "Mrs. Thomas, tell her that she is not allowed to treat me this way. This should be my home as well," I begged, my voice breaking. Once warm and gentle, Mrs. Thomas now regarded me as though I were made of glass. "Now this is Courtney's home. Perhaps you should look for another place to reside," she said. Her remarks dealt me a blow I hadn't expected. With the package in my hands and my heart pounding, I stood there. At that moment, the house I had grown to know and the family I believed I had fell apart. I stayed despite everything because I had promised Mr. Thomas on his deathbed that I would take care of his wife and make sure Courtney didn't take over. Mrs. Thomas appeared to take on Courtney's harsh characteristics day by day. Her gaze grew icy and her words became cutting. "You're just sitting on your hands here, aren't you?" One evening, as I was clearing away after dinner, Mrs. Thomas lost her temper. Her tone was tinged with contempt. I tried not to let her remarks affect me, but I still said, "I'm trying my best to keep things running smoothly." "Best? You were able to trick me. Looks like you're just taking advantage of others," she sneered before walking out of the room. Her remarks cut quite close. I had rented out my flat and given almost all of the revenue to Mrs. Thomas, so I knew I was anything but a freeloader. Besides, I did most of the chores and Courtney just offered criticism. Courtney, who was dependent on her mother's pension, was unyielding. "Really, what does my brother even see in you?" Every night she would taunt me with a voice that could be heard through the thin walls. I would remind myself of my commitment while biting my tongue to contain my rage and irritation. However, the environment in the house turned into a hostile minefield that was oppressive. When I arrived home early from work one evening, everything seemed off balance. Unaware that I had arrived, I entered the living room to find Courtney and Mrs. Thomas engaged in a contentious argument. "We must persuade her to sell her apartment," Courtney said, her tone calculated and selfish. "You know how much we could use that money." "Indeed, but how can we persuade her?" "Jasmine is not She refuses to simply give it to me," Mrs. Thomas retorted, sounding a little envious and frustrated. "Mom, leave it to me. I'll gently persuade her to do it. We can finally live the lives we deserve after she signs it over," Courtney said, her words slithering through the air like a snake. It was a sobering reality check to hear them scheme to deprive me of my only source of financial stability. I was so terrified that I was unable to stay. My heart racing, I stole quietly to my chamber. They intended to steal everything from me. I could not stay after this. The decision had been made. With my hands shaking, I hurriedly packed my belongings. Every moment I spent in that place felt like a countdown to catastrophe. They didn't deserve farewells, so I didn't bother. I stole out the back door and called a cab to get me to the station. My mind was racing with questions as I sat on the train headed to Jonathan's state. Would Jonathan be able to comprehend? Would he support me? Although I was terrified of what might happen if I stayed, the uncertainty was still unbearable. I gazed out the window, taking in the passing scenery as a mixture of resolution and anxiety settled in my chest. Jonathan responded to my arrival at his apartment with a mix of surprise, relief, and a barrage of inquiries. When he opened the door and saw me standing there with my bag in hand, appearing as stressed as I was, his eyes grew wide. "Jasmine, why are you here? Is everything in order?" he asked, moving aside to let me enter. I paused, soaking in the cozy, comfortable sight of his makeshift residence. "Jonathan, it's not okay at all. Not at all," I answered, letting my voice trail off. With a worried expression, he guided me to the couch. "Talk to me, sweetheart." "How come?" he pleaded. I told him everything, including the last straw, the scheme to force me to sell my apartment, the worsening circumstances at home, and Courtney's return. I hadn't wanted to bother him or cause him further stress while he was gone at work. As I spoke, Jonathan's face grew darker. His jaw was clenched, and his fists were tight. By the time I was done, his voice was a mixture of worry and rage. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" he demanded. I didn't want to agitate things more. I felt stupid now, but admitted. I believed I could handle it. "Damn it, Jasmine, you shouldn't have taken on anything like that alone," he said, getting up to pace the space. "I cannot comprehend how my mom and Courtney would treat you this way." He paused and fixed his piercing gaze on me. "My wife will not be treated this way by anyone." "There's no way," he exclaimed, removing his phone. With my heart racing, I watched as Jonathan called his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she answered. Jonathan's shoulders were too tight for me to hear what she was saying. "Mom, we need to end this. I'm aware of everything and I refuse to put up with it. You may forget about our assistance if Courtney stays and if you don't start treating Jasmine with dignity," Jonathan said, his tone leaving no room for disagreement. "No more money, no more nothing." After a short, heated argument, there was stillness. Jonathan gripped the phone more tightly. At last he muttered, "Fine. If that's your choice, then I've made mine," and hung up. His expression softened as he turned to face me. "Looks like we're all alone now, sweetie. That's all we require," he remarked, walking up to embrace me. I leaned against him, the security of his arms protecting me from the tumultuous wave of feelings. "Just us," I whispered, realizing that what he had said was true. Now that we were alone, it felt acceptable in some way. I talked into the night with Jonathan. We discussed realistic topics like my work-from-home schedule and our budget without the additional burden of helping his mother, Courtney. It seemed like we were starting a new chapter together, just the two of us. We're all in this together, no matter what. It's just me and you versus the world, right? Jonathan grinned determinedly and replied, right. With him by my side against the outside world, I felt more assured and grinned back. The following few days were packed with activities. Thankfully, my employer agreed to let me work remotely after I reached out to them. Jonathan assisted me in removing my belongings from storage and organizing my home office in the corner of his living room. It was our space, even though it wasn't ideal. After we had been at peace for a week, I received a call that startled me like a ghost from another life. It was Mrs. Thomas. Her voice, which had once sounded lovely to me, now radiated a mixture of boldness and desperation. Jasmine, why am I not receiving my payment for this month? You understand how much we rely on it, she insisted. For a moment, I was struck silent. She had unreal nerves. I'm sorry, but after everything, you really expect me to continue supporting you? I asked, my tone more incredulous than angry. I could hear Courtney's strident, angry voice in the background. She is merely an inconsiderate girl. Make her send the funds over, Courtney growled. I saw Mrs. Thomas's horrified expression pass before my eyes. But we're family, she finally uttered, her voice appealing and angry at the same time. No, family doesn't behave like this, I said firmly. Goodbye, Mrs. Thomas, and hung up before she could answer. I was shaken by the call, but Jonathan was there for me, offering resolute support. Jasmine, you made the correct decision, he said, putting an arm around my shoulders and soothing me. It's time they learned to stand on their own. Soon after, we returned to our hometown and received yet another surprise. We were pleasantly surprised by the news, and the future appeared full of opportunities. We decided it was time to sell my flat and purchase a modest suburban home close to a reputable school so our child could grow up there. As we were organizing our move, Mrs. Thomas gave us another call. This time, her tone was different, more frantic, almost pitiful. I apologize for my mistake. Courtney seized the money, made me sell the house, and left me with nothing. Could I maybe move in with you and Jonathan? Her request sent a shiver down my spine, and her voice was unsteady. This is a test of my determination, I murmured, maintaining a steady tone despite my internal anguish. When you united with Courtney against us, Mrs. Thomas, you decided to go this route. You could have made a different decision. You have a good heart, even if I know that I have made mistakes. Are you unable to pardon an elderly woman for her poor decisions? She begged. I sighed, knowing the suffering her decisions had caused, but still feeling sympathy. Even though I've long since forgiven you, that doesn't mean I can welcome you back into my life, I answered. You have to live with the consequences of your actions, just as I have, and hung up. I stubbornly blocked her number with a tap. We proceeded with our plans and bought a cute house with a small garden for our kids to play in. It was one of those slow Sunday mornings when you take your time reading the newspaper and sipping coffee. A headline caught my attention. As I turned the pages, the headline read, "Local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme." There I saw Courtney, looking defeated and chained, staring back at me from the page. I couldn't help but feel a wave of shock and, to be honest, slight vindication. "Look at this, Jonathan," I yelled out, holding up the newspaper for him to see. "This is Courtney. She was sent into custody for fraud." Jonathan picked up the newspaper and studied the story with a serious look on his face. "Whoa, it's a lot to process. Even though I can't say I'm surprised," he answered, feeling a sense of finality I hadn't realized I needed. "Yeah, it is. But she made decisions, and now she's facing the consequences." Eventually, we heard from acquaintances that Mrs. Thomas was working 2 jobs and living in a small apartment to make ends meet. The debt Courtney had left her was too much for her pension to pay off, in addition to her living expenses. "Did you hear about your mom? Jonathan's friend J.M. brought it up during a backyard cookout one evening. Jonathan said, "Yeah, I heard," as he continued to flip hamburgers on the grill. There was a hint of grief in his voice, but it was balanced by determination. She made her own decision. Although difficult, that is the reality. Nodding, John recognized the unwritten rules. "You're correct, dude. I just felt you ought to be aware." After that, the conversation changed to more light-hearted talk about work and sports. In the evening air, both we and life had moved on. The moment Lisa was born, the happiness we were experiencing became truly evident. Everything changed when I became a mom. It changed our aspirations and ambitions, and even filled some of the old scars with fresh love, healing them. "Can you believe she's ours?" I asked one night while Jonathan and I watched Lisa sleep soundly in her cradle. His gentle reply was, "I know," as he put his arm around my shoulders. "She's perfect." Jonathan returned with a hushed, "Just perfect," his voice full of feeling. We devoted our days to admiring every tiny accomplishment Lisa made, every smile, every giggle. She was our little miracle. When she was around, the bad memories of the past seemed to fade away, making way for pleasant ones. Every day was uncomplicated yet brimming with tiny moments of happiness that pieced together a harmonious family life. We strolled around the park, chuckling while Lisa attempted to chase butterflies. We read books and played games on chilly nights at home. Our shared love for our daughter allowed Jonathan and me to connect on a deeper level, and our relationship became stronger every day. One bright afternoon, while Jonathan was at work, I sat in the garden with Lisa, watching her play with her toys. The air was thick with the aroma of roses, and the flowers were in full bloom. It was the ideal time, a moment captured in time of the life we had created together. "Look, Mommy," Lisa exclaimed, holding out a flower she had chosen. "My dear, that's really lovely," I grinned at her. I pondered the route that had led us to this point while observing her. Although the difficulties we had faced were painful, they had brought us to this peaceful and happy spot. I was incredibly appreciative of Jonathan's love and support, as well as the strength we had discovered in one another. Jonathan reached across the table to take my hand when we sat down to dinner. That evening, Jonathan looked at me with love in his eyes and said, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," I replied, holding his hand tightly, and I would not change a thing. With optimism and resolve, we approached the future together, confident that we could conquer any obstacles that lay ahead. Our hearts were joyful, our family was solid, and our love was unshakable. We made the most of every day, savoring every second and creating a life full of love, joy, and limitless opportunities.